Mystery authors William Kent Krueger, Lori Rader-Day, and Sarah Zettel, in partnership with Aunt Agatha's Bookshop.
So the novel we're talking about is a novel called Red Knife. I don't know if any of you even remember this. It was a huge episode in Minnesota history, recent history. But a number of years ago, a school shooting occurred on the Red Lake Reservation in northern Minnesota. And it was the largest school shooting up to that point in time. Unfortunately, it has since been eclipsed numerous times. But I live in Minnesota, and something like that is not the kind of occurrence that any of us would ever have expected in Minnesota. And so it got me to thinking about the whole question of violence. Where does it come from? Why is it perpetrated? And the more I ruminated on the whole question of violence in our society, it seemed to me that as a culture, we pass violence down one generation to the next as a cultural norm, even if we're not willing to accept that. I believe that we do. And so I wanted to talk about violence in do you know, if you write a treatise on violence, that's one thing, but if you write a good, compelling story, and the whole question of violence and the tragedy that it causes is at the heart of it, people will actually read it. It's one of the most difficult books, I think, for readers to read in my series, but it's one of the books that of which I am most proud.
Yeah, I love that book. It's a wonderful book. So, Sarah, your illustration of violence comes from fairy tales, and you aren't using the Disney versions. You're using the really, really horrible Brothers Grimm versions. And can you talk about why those have captured your attention and why you're using them in your new novel?
Well, I actually grew up with the unexpurgated versions. My parents were very liberal. Any book in the house was open to me. And my great grandfather, at a time when people were educating their families by buying encyclopedias, he bought a set of books called the Harvard 5-Foot Shelf, which was actually 6 feet long. I know because I measured it because I'm a geek. And one of the books in the Harvard 5-Foot Shelf was called Aesop, Anderson, and Grimm. And I got hold of this at a very early age. And the Brothers Grimm stories in there were, as Robin says, not the Disney versions. They were the versions that were not told to children around the fire. They were the versions adults told each other. And they included justice being meted out in the form of, putting the wicked queen in a barrel full of nails and rolling her down the hill. So that stuff gets tidied up and it gets hidden away. But it's still there. It's in the undercurrent, and undercurrent interests me. Secrets interest me. The things we don't want to acknowledge, but that we might be better off if we did. Those things interest me, particularly when you get at the most personal level, when you're talking about the unacknowledged things within a family and within a house. And that's the kind of thing I wanted to talk about when I wrote Other Sister.
So, Lori, your book has like the coolest setting of all time. So
Thank you.
I want you to talk about it. I'm not even going to tell what it is. I want you to talk about it.
Under a Dark Sky, I assume we're talking about. So Under a Dark Sky, my new book is set in a dark sky park in Mackinac City, and there is a real dark sky park.
We want to go to that one.
It's
we keep talking
about it. It's called the Headlands International Dark Sky Park. A dark sky park is a designation given by the International Dark Sky Association for places, for the park version, places that take artificial light and sort of turn it down, dial it down. It's not completely dark, but it's pretty darn dark. And so during the day, you might go there to go hiking or to play in the water. They have 2 miles of beautiful lakeshore, Lake Michigan. It's right near the bridge. There's a lady wearing a T-shirt down here, the Mighty Mac Bridge. It's a beautiful location. And then at night, you can go and see the night sky the way that nature intended. And when I heard about it,
You had to do it.
well, I thought, what a great place for a murder mystery.
Yeah. Of course. Yeah.
I don't think that's what the IDA had in mind, but they've embraced it actually, and they are selling the book in their bookshop at the
Oh,
Headlands
how
now.
cool! That is
Their
great.
gift shop. Yeah.
Great. Well, so Kent, your new book's a lot of it's about his Cork's son Stephen.
Uh-huh.
And I've always loved Stephen. And his readers, we've seen him grow up. Who here has read every novel of Cork? Yeah. So I don't have to fill you
I
in
love
on-
you guys.
So in this book, he has a pretty disturbing vision, which kind of guides the story. But I wonder if you could talk about visions, like what are they? How'd you research them? Who did you talk to find out what they are? Because it's not a dream, it's a vision.
Yeah, it's not a dream. Gosh, who did I talk to? Do you want to know the absolute truth? I just made it all up.
Did you really?
Really? I just made it all up.
You're allowed to do that.
I
But-
just thought maybe there was,
You get paid for doing that.
Yesterday I had such confirmation of basically everything that I've created. So for those of you who don't know, Stephen is Cork O'Connor's son. He's the youngest child in the O'Connor clan. And he's a young man who, from his earliest time, the earliest he can remember, he always wanted to be what in the Ojibwe society is called a mide, a healer, a member of the Grand Medicine Society. And he has, throughout his life, been visited by visions, but they are never hopeful visions. They are always visions of tragedy. And so they're very difficult for him to accept and to deal with, particularly so in Desolation Mountain. So I write books in which Stephen, across the course of the series, has experienced visions. This is not something new. We did an event yesterday at a bookstore in Naperville, and one of the booksellers there pulled me aside and she said, "You know, I so understand Stephen, because all my life I have had visions
Get out.
like
What?
this."
Wow.
And she said, I have learned to block the visions because, like Stephen, it can be terrible things. And she said, I have tried in the past to warn people, and they haven't listened, and the terrible things have happened nonetheless. And she said, I don't want that response, feeling like there's something I can do or ought to be able to do, but in reality cannot. And so she has learned to block the visions. It was
That is
amazing.
That is amazing.
Where was I? I was
Yeah.
there, and I don't remember that conversation.
I said she pulled me aside. It's not something clearly that she wanted broadly known. And my mother was a visionary. I believe my daughter has had visions, and in this bookseller's case, it came from her grandmother, whom the whole family knew all her life had visions. So when I write a vision for Stephen, even though in the beginning I was creating fiction, what I believed was fiction, in the way that fiction so often functions, you find out afterward that in fact you were talking about things that are infinitely real.
That's amazing. That's a wonderful story. So my next question is for Sarah. So your characters are like sort of a fairy tale schematic. They're like fairy tale tropes, like the good sister, the bad sister, the king father, the missing mother. So how did you take those kind of tropes and make them like real flesh and blood humans?
Well,
What's your trick?
by mostly by playing on them. Okay, so let's look at the story of Cinderella, right? One of the most famous. We know who the good girl is. Cinderella is the good girl. Then we have the two ugly stepsisters who stick by her mother or her stepmother, and they are bad. If you read the Disney version, of course, all that happens in the end is Cinderella is happily married and goes off with the prince, and everything's fine. In the original version, or at least as recorded by the Brothers Grimm, which is as close we're going to get, Cinderella invites her stepsisters to the wedding. Cinderella's birds, those happy magical bluebirds, are also at the wedding.
Uh-oh.
They peck her sisters blind.
I just had a vision of that.
Yeah.
Right before you saw it happening.
Now, these are Cinderella's special friends. She commands them throughout the story She presumably knew they were there. She could have stopped them and didn't. Who's the bad sister in this scenario? The fairy tales, the old versions, are filled with that kind of ambiguity, if you look for it. So I wanted to play with the idea. I wanted to play with appearances. It also happens in families that somebody puts on the appearance of goodness, particularly if you look at the people who are called skilled abusers or who are intimate abusers. They will put on a facade of being the good one, the put upon one, the Cinderella of the story. But if you see things from another angle, that's quite different. And that was what I was playing with.
Yeah, it's a really interesting book.
You really make me want to read them.
It's a
There's
really good
Grimm
book.
stories
Yeah.
all over again. Whoa.
I recommend them. Okay, they're horror stories.
Don't the sisters have to cut their toes off to get them in the
Yes,
shoes?
yes. The stepmother urges the sisters to mutilate their. Yeah. Okay, these are horror stories. These are horror stories that have been changed. They're horror stories with magic. Cinderella is a very powerful magical figure. It is the ghost of her mother who gets her what she needs, not a fairy godmother. And she goes and deliberately asks for it. She's not waiting around for this. She's not crying over anything in this story. When she wants to go to the ball, she goes to the grave of her dead mother, to the tree that she planted years ago that is now grown up. And she asks for it. And the ghost of her mother gives it to her. When she is left with impossible tasks to do, she calls on the birds and the animals to come do the tasks for her. There is nothing weak about Cinderella. There is nothing passive about Cinderella. It's all been changed to fit the modern notion or evolving notions of what a good girl should be, which is another reason I keep going back to fairy tales, because of that evolving notion of who and what a good girl is and what lies under the surface of someone who is trying very, very hard to be a good girl.
The next thing you're going to tell us is Snow White slept with all the dwarfs.
Okay, no, but I'll tell you what happened to Snow White. I'll tell you what, okay, all right. This flipped me out because this was the earliest written down version of Snow White. So, I am not making this up. You can go, you can get the new translation from Literati, you can look this up, swear to God. So she's dead in the coffin, right? The prince comes along, sees the gorgeous body in the coffin. This prince is sick.
I have another vision.
There's no way you could possibly have a vision of how this actually unfolds. Takes her away from the dwarves, keeps the dead body in the casket in the castle. Remember I said horror stories? Okay. Has her carried from room to room with him. Told you he was sick. And then one day, the servants drop the coffin. That's when the apple jumps out of her throat and she wakes up.
That's a cool
This
story.
one I understand why the ending got changed.
Okay. So, Lori, I'm fascinated.
No. I don't know if I can follow these guys. Stop saving me for last.
Okay, well,
Robin.
I have a really good question for you. In a couple of your books, I've read the women, the central female character, her life is very small. It's been made very small by circumstances. And then I think the story of the novel is how does her world become bigger, or at least normal? So why is that so interesting to you?
Oh. Are you a therapist all of a sudden?
She's been saving this up.
So I'm from a very small town in Indiana. It's the town my dad still lives nearest to is under 400 people. He lives 4 miles from it. And then the next biggest town in the other direction is 6 miles away. So my life was very small when I was a young person, I guess. So from about the age of 12 until I went to college, I lived in the middle of nowhere.
Wow.
But that's a great life to prepare you to be a writer.
Yeah.
I don't know that I would have been writing as much and as seriously as early as I was if I had not had that kind of life. So it's probably a theme, I
It
think,
is
to bring
it
out
is a
the English
theme.
literature stuff.
Yeah. So talk about Eden.
So Eden Wallace is a young widow, a widow before her time anyway. She's about 35, I think. She finds a reservation for the guest house in the Dark Sky Park in her husband's effects 9 months after he's dead. And so she's stuck in her life. Her life has become very small. Her grief has sort of driven people away, and she's driven people away. Frankly, she's out of friends. Our family is very small. Her sister's got her own life. And so she decides to keep that reservation, go to the park, and even though she has developed a fear of the dark since her husband left, she decides she's going to honor this romantic gesture that he's planned this trip for them, and she's going to keep it. She's picturing a romantic getaway, right? But when she gets there, it's not.
It is not.
It is not.
It's not. It's not romantic.
Spoiler.
No.
It's not. He's not there for one thing. Also, there are 4 bedrooms in the guest house. It's not a single cabin for 2. It's like a bunker. It's got 6 other people in the house, and they all know each other, and they've dragged their problems along behind them. And one of them is dead before sunrise.
Yeah, you don't mess around. Yeah, she doesn't mess around. Yeah. So, Kent, when you started your wonderfully long series, did you have an arc in mind for your characters? Like, did you always know Joe was going to die? And
Oh, thanks for letting the cat out of the
come
bag.
on! Everybody knows that, right?
At various times in this series, I have been able to sort of see where I wanted things to go, and would sort of think, okay, at what point is this really going to happen? So I knew Joe was going to die about 3 books before she did.
Aw,
Yeah.
that's devilish of you.
Dang.
I know.
I didn't know
Cold,
she
isn't
was
it?
going to die.
You guys are downers.
You didn't know she was
I
going to
had
die?
sort of a different fate for her in mind, and then I bagged it.
So what was the different fate?
She was just going to disappear
Oh.
in the mountains, and
Oh,
Cork
and
was never
never-
going to find her.
Oh.
Or at
Oh, and
least
that's supposed to be better?
No,
How's that better?
No,
At least
it wasn't
at that
better.
point.
Yeah.
I thought I would always leave the door open, a la soap opera, to bring her back.
But it
Don't you
also,
remember me, Cork? I'm your long-lost wife. I had amnesia.
it also keeps Cork, though, stuck there, doesn't it? Is that one of your
Yes.
considerations?
Well, and
Kinda.
how often in real life does that happen?
Right.
But in real life, we lose people. We lose people we love. And that was so much more interesting journey to
For
follow
Cork,
Cork
yeah.
on, was the death, this great wounding to him and to his family. And then the journey after that is over across several books, the journey of the healing from that great wound until he's really finally able to say goodbye and move on in his life. Much more interesting
Oh,
as
definitely.
arc.
Yeah.
But when I began the series, I had a 3-book arc in mind. When I began writing Iron Lake, the first book of my series, like everybody who's never published before, all I wanted to do was write a book that was good enough to be published. Somebody might really want to read it. But about 3/4 of the way through the writing of that manuscript, I realized I had created relationships that were so complex, I was never going to be able to bring them all together at the end of that particular volume. So I thought, where is it in Cork and everybody's life where I wanted them to be? And I knew where that was, and I thought, okay, it's probably, given how life really works, it's probably going to take about 3 books to get there. So if you look at the first 3 books in this series, Iron Lake, Boundary Waters, and Purgatory Ridge, it's the arc of the dissolution and then the coming back together of Cork, his wife, and his family. It's the other place I imagined them being. So periodically, I do know where I'm going. Sometimes I haven't a clue.
Well, I do think also that you're illustrating the change in mysteries because you're talking about series fiction, and I think a lot of current mysteries are standalones. I think that's sort of the way it's going, and it's sort of changing the readership a little bit. You guys have any thoughts about that at all?
I think series are still popular.
Oh, they are.
I think
They are.
I think in some ways it's easier on series writers now because I hate to bring up a dirty word, but Amazon and ebooks means it's easier to find.
Oh, the backlist.
If you see
Yeah.
book 4 of a series and this looks really interesting, you can go find books 1, 2, and 3 more easily than you could when I was starting out. In fact, when I was in college, before any of this happened, that was one of our big complaints. It's like, it's book 3 of the series. I can't get books 1 and 2.
True.
So I think it's a balancing act. There have been some very, very successful standalones. I think we could, look at Gillian Flynn.
Yeah. Girl on the
And
Train
Gone Girl. So I think it's, that's brought on a trend. Paula Hawkins, another one. So, nothing succeeds like success.
I write standalones. I don't know that I
do.
have an opinion on whether it's the future or not. I just know that I haven't written a book where I thought, I can't wait to write 17 of these.
Yeah.
But
Let's do it. 17 of these. No.
well, I didn't start out thinking I was
Well,
gonna.
yeah.
But The Day I Died has a character.
That's a title. Sorry. Don't worry.
It's the
title
book
of her
that's
last
currently
book.
up for the Anthony
Yeah.
Award.
Yeah.
The protagonist in that has such an interesting occupation that
she
seems to me
does.
to lend itself to all kinds of stories. And she's such a wonderful, complex, compelling character. I really expected you to continue using her.
That book took 10 years to write, so that's
So
probably
every 10 years
Every
you
10
produce
years.
that might be why I didn't
Yeah.
go right into book 2. It has been suggested by several people that book might have serious potential.
So is
But
that
at the moment,
possibly?
no.
It's really just my attention span. That's it. I need.
You can stick with one book for 10 years.
Well, there was some stuff in between. It wasn't continuous.
Yeah, she wrote some other stuff.
Got some other books published.
Yeah.
But when I wrote my first book that got published, a lot of people thought, okay, here we go, The Black Hour 2. And I didn't do that. And I think it was because I needed the shiny new idea to get to the page every day. I was writing during my lunch hours. I worked at a very difficult job with a very difficult boss.
Have you killed him yet?
I have not killed her yet. She deserves it.
Are you still working for her?
I am not. I left 3 years ago.
Quit
So-
first,
I have a
then
really
kill him.
nice boss, by the way. She's sitting in the second row. I'm very lucky.
Yeah.
So,
There are good bosses.
so
I hear.
actually, Laura, you went to a classic for your new book, though, because it's kind of based on And Then There Were None.
It wasn't-
So that's kind of a tricky
I
plotting
don't
device.
base things.
But
I
it's
don't.
sort
I don't
of
have
a-
a base.
It's not
I
a
just
base,
start
but
writing.
it's, but so that wasn't in your head at all when you start. Really?
Nothing is ever in my head. You're
You're a
giving me
very
so
smart
much
person.
credit. I
I
am
mean-
not a plotter. I am not a 3-book vision writer. I'm sort of the person who finds a couple points on the map and starts writing. So I had the location first for Under a Dark Sky, Dark Sky Park. That sounds great. That sounds like a murdery place, right?
Yeah,
It's a
that's
great
true.
place. You should
It
go.
was a murdery place. Yeah.
And then I thought, okay, young widow, that's something that I'm afraid of. So I can see some potential for
Oh, that's
story there.
interesting.
And then I started researching the location and found that guest house and the difficulty with knowing, is this by the room or by the person, or how is this rental price working? And I thought, oh, well, there's an opportunity for story there too. And then I started writing.
And then you started killing off all the characters.
Check the record, bub.
kill as
There are
many.
not that many deaths in there.
Oh, you're right. There's some bad stuff.
Well, there's some
Yeah.
stuff. Don't tell them
All right,
about it.
all right. So, Sarah, I liked how your book, what's going on is sort of, you almost keep it a secret till like the very end. I mean, it's a horrible family thing going on, but you're not quite sure what it is.
I'm actually really glad to say that because I thought they kind of gave it away on the tagline.
I don't think so at all.
Okay, cool.
No, you got to read the whole book to find out what's going on. So, for all three of you, writing is a wonderful job, but it is a job. What makes you excited, like to sit down and get back to work and write something every day?
Every day.
Ken, you're looking puzzled.
Every day is aspirational. I love the process. I have always loved the process. It is like a long-term relationship. There are individual days when it is enormously frustrating. In fact, Friday. Friday. You know that day when the person you love hasn't made the bed, hasn't cleaned up the kitchen, which is their job, has said something totally irrational that has gotten on your last nerve and you really need to leave the house now?
You're speaking to my wife.
It's-
Sorry, honey.
Where is she? Oh, there she is.
It's a 2, 3, 4-way street.
Mhm.
And writing is like that some days. Some days writing gets on your last nerve. Some days you don't know. Some days it's like parenting. What made me think I could do this? And yet, there are the days when you go back and you read that passage and you're like, oh my God, that actually works. That's actually good. I made a thing. And then you get to see your name on the book. And then
Which name is this?
Yeah, that's right.
You
Which
can
of
name
the
any name.
five?
I like them all.
It could be any
And then you
five.
get a letter from somebody who says, I really enjoyed this book. And if you're supremely lucky, occasionally you get a letter that somebody says, this book got me through a day when I needed it. I love the process, all of it.
How about you?
I can't say that I love the process, all of it. I like some of the process, and I love having created something that wasn't there before. That is an amazing moment when you realize I wrote something that nobody else could have written. I have a lot of bad days. I do not write every day. We talked about this yesterday, so Kent knows all about it. I had to go first before he got into his like every day for 4 hours.
Oh,
thing.
he's one of those.
He's so regimented that I'm like, don't ask him yet. Let me talk first.
It's a guy thing.
Is it? I don't know.
It is. The only people
think
I
it's
know
him.
who do that are guys.
Really? But
Yeah.
you also like see entire books, don't you? Like you have visions.
When Laura's finished, I'm going to have my say.
Stop with the visions. You have visions of whole books.
Yeah.
I'm so mad at you right now. And here I am like, well, I know she's a widow. Let's see what that's about. I like the exploration. I like the mystery of the entire story, not just the mystery, but what's going to happen to these characters? How are they going to get through
Whatever it is.
what's
yeah.
happening to them? And in some ways, I think it helps me not to have too many things figured out so I can work it out on the page. And it means I spend a lot more time in revision, perhaps, than someone who has visions. Can't compete with that. But what I enjoy revision because I know I have it in my back pocket. I can always go back and make this book better. I have the time. And I'm going to make it better as soon as I get to the end and I know what the thing is about.
Let's
Go
hear about-
ahead.
Let's hear about the vision.
Come on, Gunner. Let's do it.
So I didn't publish my first novel until I was 47 years old.
Woo, late bloomer.
But I have always written. And my schedule for the last, since I was in my early 20s is this. I get up at 5:45 in the morning, I get myself dressed, and I go to a coffee shop where I spend, back in the old days, it was only about an hour before I had to go to work. These days, it's 2 hours every morning, 7 days a week. And I did that long before I was ever a published author. And why? Because, like you, Sarah, I so love the process of writing. I love just setting a challenge for myself and seeing how well I've met that challenge. And particularly in the early days before I was published, it was just total freedom. I could do anything that I wanted to do because who the hell cares, you know? And so that became my routine. And I continue to follow that to this day. Now that this is my full-time job, I go back to the coffee shop in the afternoon and I write for 2 more hours. But this is one of the things that it does for me. When I finally stopped and looked back across all of those years, I realized that going to the coffee shop wasn't just my discipline. It was the way I centered myself in every day and created the energy I needed to go out into the world and give to it whatever I had to give to it to, keep a roof overhead and food on the table, because I'd taken care of this thing that was so important to who I was. So it's not just like this regimen. I love getting up in the morning because I love the result of that morning at the coffee shop bent to my work. Now, I love the creative part of it. I love that first draft, writing that first draft. That's just what then comes the revision, which I hate.
You hate revision?
I hate revisions.
Oh.
It makes the book better, but I hate revisions.
I eventually hate revisions.
So when you were all,
The
when
other
you were like free before you started writing mysteries, were you writing mysteries? Is that what you
No.
No. What were you writing?
I was trying to write the great American novel.
Well, you did. You wrote Ordinary Grace.
Yeah, that took me a long time too, huh?
Yeah.
More than 10 years.
Yeah.
No, I was, yeah. So here's the story I tell. My father was a high school English teacher, and when I was 18 years old, insisted that I read Ernest Hemingway. And I fell madly in love with Hemingway. Well, I liked his writing well enough, but what I really fell in love with was that mythic image of Ernest Hemingway. There was this guy who joined the Italian army long before the World War I, long before the United States got involved in that conflict. He drove an ambulance. He was wounded. He got a medal for it. After that, he hung out in Paris with all the great names of the lost generation. He hobnobbed with matadors. He was a big game hunter, a legendary brawler and drinker, and he'd been
6
given
wives.
the Nobel Prize. What was that?
6 wives.
Yeah,
Okay.
Bam!
The guy was not perfect,
Anyway,
but
sorry.
he'd been given the Nobel Prize for writing the kind of fiction nobody had ever written before. When I was 18 years old, like a lot of young male wannabe writers, I wanted to be Ernest Hemingway. And so I spent 20 years trying to write the great American novel as he might have. And then I hit a midlife crisis and said, the hell with that. I want to write something somebody's going to read. And I looked around me to see what people read, and I saw that everybody reads mysteries. Everybody reads mysteries. And so I thought, okay, I'm going to write a mystery. And it worked.
Yeah. That's a cool story. So can you each of you talk about a recent book you've read that you loved, that you thought was really great? And what's your next book, your personal next book going to be?
I just read a mystery I had never heard of before, and I absolutely loved it. Okay, now, you guys are going to think that I am a depressed person. I want you to know that under other names, I write romances, and I write fluffy cat mysteries, and I, do have occasional happy
Cat
things.
mysteries?
Yeah, we have some out there. She writes
Yeah.
kitty
Do
mysteries.
the cats solve the mysteries?
They help.
Yeah.
They're magical cats.
Okay. Oh, magical cats. Okay. Go ahead. Continue.
It's under a different name. Yeah.
So I just want you to know that there is love and sunshine in my life. But I just finished this book called Overtumbled Graves by Jess. It's either Waters or Walters. I forget which.
Walters.
But
Yeah.
he's a journalist, and he was the guy who wrote what is considered the definitive story about Ruby Ridge. So he has dealt in violence, and it is a serial killer story. I hate serial killer stories, and if you corner me later, I will tell you all about why. But this is a very, very different take on it, and it is a highly realistic take in that it does not in any way romanticize the action or mythologize a la Thomas Harris and what's his name, Hannibal Lecter. It doesn't do any of that. And it is a fantastic presentation of the female character and the difficulties of her relations with the male characters, particularly in attitude, between her take on what is happening and their take on what is happening. And it gets into the egos of the profilers. And it's a fascinating, riveting downer. Do not read this unless you have something happy to do afterwards, but read this book. It's a good book. You can get it. Now that I ordered it from Robin and Jamie, but now that we can't do that anymore, it is
Go
something
ahead.
you can
Order
order.
it from Amazon.
I am a Libris will get it for you. IndieBound will get it for you. And I am working on a book right now called A Mother's Love. We're back to families behaving badly. And it is about okay, so there have been endless stories about girls who are kidnapped and their fathers save them. This is a girl who is kidnapped and her mother saves her. Because I wanted to do that. I wanted to play with the gender take, and, not that I'm,
Raging feminist.
Yeah,
Yeah.
okay, the big F. But when you become a mother, frequently your story stops. or when you become a mother, frequently what you become is the subject of blame for everything. You miss a ballet recital, your kid needs 20 years of therapy. So I wanted to write a different story. I wanted to write maybe not a more realistic story, but I wanted to write a story where the mother kind of got to be the hero in the end. So that's what I'm doing. Thank you.
I just read November Road by Lou Burney. Yeah, he's dreamy. It is out in October. I don't know which day, but it's so good. It's a story. It's a crime story about like a low-level mafia connected guy who has done some little errand for his big boss, and then Kennedy is shot, and he realizes his little errand is a piece in that.
Oh, cool.
And so things change really quickly. But it's also, in a way, a love story, and it's beautiful. It's just, you're going to cry. It's great. I hate him a lot because he's so good. We have the same editor, and I'm vastly jealous of him. I am working on a book. I'm about 20,000 words away from being finished with the first draft. I don't talk about a book too much before that, the end, because then I have to go back to the beginning and see what it's really about. But it's a fiction story, but it's got a true crime element to it. And the idea came from one day I was talking to my brand new neighbor who had moved into the house next door. And I live in Chicago, where the houses are really close together. And we share a fence. It's really their fence. They had just moved in with their 2-year-old daughter, really cute, playing in the backyard. And I said, we're interested in getting a new fence at some point. Now, we could put it on our side and just leave your fence where it is. This is yours. Or if you hate this chain link fence, it's kind of ugly, right? Like, if you hate this, we could pull this up and do the fence together and decide what it looks like together. And she said, oh, that's great. I really want to talk to you about that. We hate this fence. I hate this chain link. It's low. You can reach over and get eaten. I was kidnapped as a child, and I said, stop! Shut up! You were kidnapped? She was kidnapped as a child. She was rescued by a stranger. She was stolen by a stranger from her daycare. Someone reached over the fence and took her, and they didn't notice she was gone for quite a while. It was an older lady who took her and was going to get her a cookie or something from her house, and then her dogs attacked her. So she was dropped off at the local Walmart parking lot, bloody, from a dog attack. And someone said, isn't that so-and-so's kid?
What's she doing?
What is she
in the
doing
parking
here?
lot?
They're at work. So she was okay. But I thought, yeah, I'm going to write about that. So I said, oh, just so you know, they're still at the fence here. Just so you know, you just became the character of my next book. Is that okay? And she's cool with it. So
that's good.
Yeah. Very cool. So yeah, I'm writing that.
So
and
kidnapping is clearly in the air right now.
There's a taste of kidnapping. Yeah. And one quick thing, the character as an adult is now a volunteer with one of those websites where amateurs try to pair unidentified remains with missing people.
Oh, wow.
And one day she sees her kidnapper's face on the missing persons side of that website. So that's where the story begins.
I wish to read this.
Yeah?
I can't wait to
Oh,
read
I like
it.
your
wish to read
face.
this book.
That sounds awesome.
Probably next year around this time.
Okay.
Cool.
Meet you here? Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
I'd love to
Today.
be back.
Let's do that thing.
How about you, buddy? What are you writing next?
My fall is going to be so empty next year.
Oh, I know. Mine
No
too.
visit to Aunt Agatha's.
Yeah. Actually, we have a picture of an early visit. This is from about 15 years ago. Kent used to travel with the crowd when they dressed up. It was really fun.
But notice
though.
who the convict is.
Well, the convict is Kent, yes.
So shady.
Yes, this is a very dusty
That was
picture we've
fun.
had on top of a shelf for a long time.
Those were fun years.
Yeah.
So what am I supposed to do?
What are you writing next? What's your next book?
Oh, something you're reading.
And what have you read
What
that
are
you
you
what am I reading?
reading? Yeah.
The most fun read that I've had lately is a book written by a guy named Howard Michael Gould. The book is called Last Look. And I met this guy at Left Coast Crime in Reno. It's a mystery conference. sat on a panel with him, and he was just so delightful on the panel. Last Look was his debut. It wasn't even out yet, but I asked him if I could get an early look at it, maybe with an eye toward a dust jacket quote. And
Wow, that's nice of you.
yeah, and I don't always love the books that I say, let me have a read. I loved this book. What makes me fall in love with that story is really his character. And the main character in this is so delightfully compelling in such odd ways that I love the book. I love the story. This guy used to be a writer of scripts in Hollywood, got tired of Hollywood, decided to turn to writing mysteries, and I think he'll be a name to watch. He'll be a name to watch, which is the kind of thing you put on a dust jacket quote.
Right, exactly.
Name to watch.
Yeah.
What am I working on? It's called Last Look. Howard Michael Gould.
Look at people are writing it down. That's
Oh,
great.
I
You've
love
done a
going to
service.
libraries. Look at them all.
So if you read his book and you like it and you send him a note, tell him I told you to read it. So what am I working on?
If he says kidnapping, I'm going to be
He's
worried.
not.
Well, actually,
Seriously?
I have finished the companion novel to Ordinary Grace. For those who've read Ordinary Grace.
That is great news.
So I'm working on revisions right now.
Oh, so sorry.
Yeah, but not the fun part. But the thing about revisions is you recognize that it gets better and better with each pass. Could I just tell them very briefly the journey of the writing?
Please.
Okay,
Yeah.
so for those of you who've read Ordinary Grace, when I proposed that project to my publisher, they didn't want it. In fact, they called me out to New York City and set me down and said, Kent, we only want Cork O'Connor novels from you. So I knew if I wrote the manuscript, it was going to be a pretty risky proposition. My publisher didn't want it. I had no idea if anybody else would, but it was a story that spoke to me in such a compelling way that I knew I had to write it. When it was finished, even though my publisher didn't want it, I went ahead and sent it to my agent, my editor, and she fell in love with it, and they published it. And the book's had just this wonderfully gratifying reception out there. Won a lot of awards, and it continues to be translated in multiple languages. And it's on track at this point, if sales continue to go the way they're going, to eclipse my entire Cork O'Connor
Get
oeuvre
out.
at some point.
Really? We sell a lot of copies of that book.
Yeah. So when my publisher saw how well the book was doing, did they want a follow-up novel? So I signed a contract, and as I'm fond of saying, they paid me a shitload of money for that. And I spent the next 2 years writing what I believed would be the companion novel to Ordinary Grace. Now that manuscript was contractually due to my publisher this month 3 years ago. 2 months before that contractual deadline, I set up a meeting with my agent in Chicago to talk about revisions to the manuscript because there were problems with it. I knew it, she knew it. 2 days before I met with her, I sent her an email saying, when we get together, I don't want to talk about how we're going to revise this piece. I want to talk about how we keep it from being published. Because it wasn't the story I'd imagined it would be. I hadn't a clue at that point how to make it that story. And frankly, I wasn't interested anymore. So I have a good agent. And as it turns out, a very understanding publisher. So they said, fine, we won't press you on this manuscript, but you still owe us a follow-up novel. So here was the deal on that, and I'm sure writers can relate to this. The expectations for that follow-up novel were so weighty, immense, heavy, that I just felt crushed the whole time I was trying to write that story. And when all of those expectations finally got lifted off my shoulders and I felt free again, I saw the story I should have been writing, and that's what I've been at work on for the last 2 years. It's called This Tender Land, and I call it a companion novel rather than a sequel or anything else because, like Ordinary Grace, it's set in southern Minnesota rather than the northern Minnesota of my Cork O'Connor series, and like Ordinary Grace, it's set in an earlier time. This Tender Land is the story of 4 orphans running from the law because they've been accused of a pretty heinous crime, kidnapping.
Get out.
but for all the right reasons. And they know that if they take to the roads, they're going to be captured pretty quickly because a huge manhunt has been launched to capture them. They're afraid if they take to the rails, because the rails back then, everybody was riding the rails in the Depression, and the railroads were patrolled by these private cops called bulls, and they could be incredibly cruel men. So they don't want to risk that. So what they do instead is they take to the rivers. They canoe the Gilead River to the Minnesota River to the Mississippi, and their plan is to canoe all the way down to St. Louis, where they have family and they believe they'll be safe. I have always wanted to write an updated version of Huckleberry Finn.
Uh-huh.
This is my Huckleberry
That sounds
Finn.
great. Does that come out next fall?
It'll be out this time next year.
I
Really
got
cool.
bit really, really early. I knew I wanted to be a writer when I was 13, and I got very, very lucky. And in my high school, there was a teacher who taught a class called Writing for Publication.
Wow, in high school.
I
In
that's
high
neat.
school,
That's
I
really
have never met anybody who had such a class. I've
Yeah.
never met anybody else who taught such a class. His name is Thomas B. DQ. I like candles to this guy, and it's all his fault. But all the weirdos took that class, and he assumed we were already writing, and he was correct about most of us. But he taught us how to research a market, how to format a manuscript, how
Wow.
to keep. Yeah, this is crazy. He meant it. I got my first rejection slip in that class.
Is it framed?
Is it?
Okay, so the 10th anniversary of that first rejection slip, I had saved all my rejection slips because I'm a masochist, and I had a party. 10 years of effort. I was going to have a party. And I took all my rejection slips and I taped them end to end and I hung them around the living room as the decoration. And one of my roommates at the time very helpfully measured that banner. 55 and a half feet of rejection. That's an average of 5.5 feet of rejection a year. I was intensely proud. And when I go and talk, I've still got it. I kept it. I scrolled it up. When I go to schools, and first I have to explain to kids, what paper rejection slips were like, and I unroll it for them to show them that if you really want to do this, you can do it. You can have it. You can be from anywhere and do this, but this is what you're going to face. So get ready for it. And somebody will, and so it's a great visual aid. But so I started submitting in high school, and I went to college this was all I ever seriously wanted to do. So I went to college with an eye on taking classes that would teach me to write practically. I didn't want to go the MFA route. I figured an MFA was only going to teach me how to teach, and God bless all the teachers in the universe, but the last thing I wanted to do was teach. And so I finally, when I got out of college, I got a job as a technical writer. I wrote software manuals, and during the day I wrote my software manuals, and then I came home and I wrote fiction. So I never had a transition. This was my work life. I wrote to pay the rent. I wrote to have fun. I have a very narrow life.
Are you still doing the technical writing?
No,
I
I
think it's what he's
married a
asking,
guy
like-
with a steady paycheck.
There you go. Marry up.
Yes. And I actually lost my last job 2 weeks before we got married. And we decided that having a novel on deadline and finishing up plans for a wedding and trying to find a new job was a little bit much. So we would see what would happen if I dropped one of those things. And funny, the day job is what got dropped.
I worked full time at that difficult job I mentioned, working for who I call the actual devil, trademark symbol, actual devil, at a university in just north of Chicago, in a scenic, along Lake Michigan. You may have heard of it. It's Northwestern. I worked there for 6 years after I got my MFA.
See, what did I know? What did I know? It was 10 years after that. The woman who wrote The Historian, whose last name I can never pronounce,
Keskova.
got the
Elizabeth.
highest advance ever for a book for writing a vampire novel with no sex and no blood in it. coming out of U of M's MFA program, what the hell did I know?
That has not been my experience. But, what I got from the MFA program wasn't. I can teach. I have a what they call a terminal degree. I could teach at a university now. I've done a little bit of that, but mostly I worked as an administrator. I was never a professor at Northwestern. I was an administrator, staff, lower level staff, actually higher level staff, but for the actual devil. So, so 6 years of that I wrote during my lunch hours, and it was hard. You were talking about the discipline, and like that's when I had the most discipline. That was the hour I had, and so that was the hour that I worked. The transition came when the actual devil turned and looked at me one day and realized that I had just sold my third novel while I was working for her. I didn't do any of that work at work. I did it at my lunch hour, but
You are not about to say she fired you.
she didn't fire me, but I think she wanted to. So I thought, okay, I could spend the next 6 months for her to get the paperwork together. She's a fiction writer herself, just FYI. I think she could have done it in 6 months, and I thought, or I could spend the next six months writing, finishing The Day I Died, and make it the best book it can be. And I moved to HarperCollins because of that decision. I was able to sell my book to a big five because I left my job when I did. So I left on my own terms. Pretty happy with that decision 3 years later, and I never had to go on anxiety medication, which is where we were going.
So before I became a writer full time, I was a professional collector of baby spit. Not a stay-at-home dad. I got paid to collect baby spit. Do you want to know why?
Yes. Yeah.
I figured you would. So I ran a research laboratory at the University of Minnesota, the Institute of Child Development, and the professor whose laboratory I oversaw, her area of expertise was stress. How, as human beings, do we develop the mechanisms that help us deal with the ordinary, everyday stressors of life? So we looked at kids who were undergoing typical stressful situations. We looked at children who were transitioning from home care into kindergarten. It can be a very chaotic transition. We looked at children who were undergoing their 2, 4, 6 month inoculations, a painful experience. Oh, circumcision. We also looked at boys who were being circumcised. Don't let anybody tell you it doesn't hurt. To look at stress, you're looking for a hormone called cortisol. It's always in our bodies, but we know it's there in larger amounts if we've undergone a stressful experience. So theoretically speaking, if you know the level of cortisol in a child before a stressful experience, and you know the level of cortisol following, you get what's called a gauge of reactivity. How stressful was it for the child? To get at the cortisol, you take a saliva sample because you can assay that saliva for the amount of cortisol in it. So one of the main parts of my job was coming up with creative ways to get kids to spit at me, which is not as easy as it sounds. So the transition from collecting baby spit to being a full-time writer began with this. Woohoo! Woohoo!
That's really funny.
But I already had the discipline of writing every single day. I just extended the amount of time I was able to write in the morning, and then I began going back in the afternoon. So it wasn't a tremendous transition for me, but it was a great liberation.
I'm sure. I have written romance. I've written young adult. I've written several flavors of mystery. Landed at the moment in suspense. God knows what's next. This is partly because of a short attention span, partly because I am a mercenary. When my mother grew up Depression era poor. My mother grew up in really lousy circumstances on the south side of Chicago in the 30s. When I announced that I was going to be a writer, you can imagine the joy that filled this woman's heart. She was terrified that I was going to enter into poverty, and she made it really, really clear that I should be a lawyer instead. I tell you. So the way I was going to fight back, my rebellion was going to be, I was, by God, going to make money. So I was not only going to learn to write, I was not only going to write what I loved, and I loved everything, I was going to, by God, make money. So I was going to learn to not write one kind of thing. I was going to learn to write what sold. And if I have just completely tarnished myself in your eyes by not following my passion, I'm sorry, but that's what it is. So when the science fiction stopped selling, and it did, lost 2 sets of contracts in a single week. That was a bad week. I said, okay, what else can I do? So I went to romance, and when the romance slowed down, I'm like, well, YA is going through a real renaissance. Let's see if I can tackle that. And that was fun because I got to write my take on Dorothy and the Wizard of Oz, and I got to write the line. In case you haven't noticed, we're not in Fairyland now; we're in Kansas. So that was a fun day. And then those didn't do as well as I'd hoped, so I, turned to mystery. Will I write science fiction again? Maybe. Science fiction is undergoing a real renaissance right now, but the problem is I found out when I wrote science fiction I had exactly 1 plot. So I need to get a new plot. I wrote it about 5 times, and that was about my limit on that. So sorry? Urban fantasy could happen. I honest to God don't know. Right now I'm in the phase where I've really got to be focused on A Mother's Love. It's due at the beginning of November. It is maybe halfway written, if I'm lucky. So I got nothing. I got nothing but this right now.
Selling books is meeting people like you guys, and especially Ken. I've known you for 20 years, and I'm going to miss seeing you. And I thank all of you for being here because you're my customers, and we love you.
But it's booksellers like Jamie and Robin who keep us coming back to a store time and time again.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
This program was recorded on August 26th, 2018, at the Ann Arbor District Library.